Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today in our cybersecurity webinar. My name is Elaine Wang. I'm the Cloud Solutions Director at Rectron. With me today, I've got some really amazing guests as we hosted a panel discussion around cybersecurity. And of course, this is something I think that's very important to any businesses today, especially given the increase on work from home. So without further ado, I want to hand over to my guests to introduce themselves before we get started. Shall we get started with Toby?
Hello, I'm technically not a guest. I'm the moderator of this conversation, and my day job is publishing a magazine called Stuff and a news website called Scroller.Africa. But I've been a technology journalist for the last 20 years, and I feel like I could stand up at a Paranoids Anonymous meeting and go, my name is Toby Shapshak, and I'm deeply, deeply paranoid and anxious about my data and personal and computer security, which is probably why I've been asked to do this, because I think we live in a world of ever-present dangers that most people just don't know how to see and don't know what is out there, and just how dangerous all of this cybersecurity, all the threats, the cybersecurity threats are. So I'm going to be speaking to a bunch of very smart people, obviously much smarter than me, and we're going to run through some of the things. Let's just start. Let's start with Colin Erasmus from Microsoft. Talk us a little bit about your responsibilities there.
Morning, Toby. Thank you very much. And yes, hopefully we can get rid of some of your paranoia by the end of this. So just very quickly, Colin Erasmus has been at Microsoft for many, many years, about 20 years now. Currently look after the modern work business, which really looks after everything from the traditional office that you know on your PC all the way up to advanced security products. So hoping to shed some light with some of the panelists today. So thank you for the invite, Toby.
My pleasure. Simon Perry.
Hi, I'm Simon Perry from Bitdefender. I'm in the pre-sale side of things. So really we sort of, I guess, address business concerns specifically on what type of components or controls that we should be putting into businesses, but we're really there to help and consult to the organizations.
And lastly, Peter French.
Hi, so I'm Peter French, representing Acronis, and I have a deep-rooted interest in IT security. It's been my game for the last 14 or 15 years already, at least commercially, and I've had a great interest in it for years prior, from my teens. Yes, or even pre-teens, I've always loved breaking and hacking and, learning how things work. Maybe not malicious hacking, but, learning to understand the way systems work. And now in my day-to-day, I engage with partners throughout Africa, assisting them and advising them in data protection strategies rooted around backup and cybersecurity.
Well, let's just kick off, because things have changed. I mean, our audience is pretty tech savvy. You understand how things have shifted. In case anyone's been Rip Van Winkling for the last 6 months, we've suffered a major global pandemic. It's the kind of stuff we saw in movies like Contagion. And yet here we are living this strange life where, if you can, and a lot of the people on this webinar can, work from home and live in a technology bubble. But the threats haven't changed, have they, Simon? But what are the biggest threats that you're seeing as Bitdefender in the market?
Yes, thanks, Toby. I think there are three big ones that I'm going to talk about. I mean, ransomware probably being the number one global threat that we're seeing on today's market. Is we all know it's a piece of malware that's generally delivered by a piece of email, and then what it generally does, it actually encrypts your data on your machine. And the biggest concern is that, it then asks for some type of ransom where, the guys are asking for a bit currency along those lines, so that you can actually then, get the decryption key, so you can actually then get your data back. That's some of the big things that we're seeing from a ransomware point of view. And I mean, specifically in South Africa, some of the, we've seen it in the news. I think City of Joburg were one of the organizations that was hit end of last year. One of the big international groups, Garmin, I mean, they all got their sporting devices I think a majority of people were affected with that, and it came down to Garmin actually paying the ransom. There's a lot of discussions, I guess, with regards to organizations. Do they pay the ransom, or do they, hopefully recover it from, backups and stuff like that? So ransomware is a big one. Phishing campaigns have been a big driver within the organizations and the markets these days, specifically with COVID. A lot of people are trying to pretend, that they have maybe some vaccines for COVID, and the guys are sending out these phishing campaigns, posing as trustworthy type of trustworthy contacts. But in the end, it's really there for you to, convince you to try click on a link so that, you maybe infect your machine. Could be another payload of malware. And that's a big worry. And I guess security awareness for your users becomes a big thing that we need to drive. And the third thing that I probably want to touch on is probably insider threats. So insider threats is a big worry because, you've got, a number of people in your organization. That could be permanent staff, you could have contractors, but you land up in a situation where sometimes your users don't know what they're doing with data. Sensitive data could be shared through, different means. And sometimes, it could be a mistake, but in other cases, it could be malicious. And that potential damage to an organization, is a massive concern for an organization. So really, those are the three biggest threats that I'm seeing at this stage. There's a number that of threats that I probably haven't touched base, but the three that I'd probably focus on are those three, Toby.
I agree. I do think those are the things top of mind. But I suppose it's part of a much bigger process, isn't it? I'm going to speak to you, Colin. You're responsible for new work. If you work out what it is, tell us all, please. Or is it just more of the same, just at home? I'm kidding. But there are a lot more risks to South African business. I run a small publishing house myself. We've, apart from the lack of income and the, lack of sales, there are much more risks, especially for an organization where in the past everyone would be in one building. Therefore, your physical perimeter, as it were, is different. Now you have people working from just about everywhere, and the challenges are much more extreme.
Yeah, so we hit the nail on the head, and I think the big difference is you go back, not even that long, 5 years ago, and we all had this network perimeter that we understood, and everything was inside this perimeter, and we understood what an employee was, we understood what a device was, what an asset was that we owned. Now that is completely changed, right? With remote work from home now, we now have devices that sit outside of these traditional perimeters that we understood. We have people that are potentially not our employees. We have partners that we invite onto our network to do presentations, as an example. And that has all meant that we have to change the way we think about doing security. And also a lot of people think, we're in the cloud, we're safe. We also need to think about how we apply security into the cloud. I'll give you a good example. We nowadays have people using up to 5, up to 10 different types of applications within an organization. In many instances, those applications may not sit on your network or even in the chosen cloud that you've chosen to go to, or a hybrid version. And these all pose very, very interesting risks. We also have to have a look at how we protect our data now, because the one thing is something like identity and access management, and how we access and how we manage our identity onto these different platforms. But we also need to think ultimately, at the end of the day, how we protect our data. And previous speakers spoke about insider risk, and that's something very, very real for us. So not only do we have to think about how we protect our PCs, our assets, our people, but we also now need to think about how we protect our data. And I think later on we'll have a discussion around Poppy or Popia, and maybe get a little bit more in depth as to what that may potentially mean.
Excited. I'm personally very excited by Poppy or Popia. I don't know how we're supposed to pronounce it yet, but that's going to come into effect only in July next year. And it is very, very strict, if people are not aware of it, very strict rules around how data can be collected, stored, used, etc. And it's very much in line with where the world is going to. But I'm going to ask you, Elaine, what is it that people are doing generally to protect themselves? What are the common things you think perhaps that also are being overlooked?
So I think Colin touched on a lot of the things that people are currently doing. So I guess I would talk about like pre-pandemic times, making sure that everything within your network is secured. So putting up all the necessary firewalls. There's a lot of protection around around your devices, and I think this worked really well in the pre-work from home world. But of course, now with everyone working from home, it gets a little bit tricky because, of course, people sitting at home don't have necessarily the right protection in their home networks. If you think about how many networks ship with just very generic admin username and passwords, and how easy it actually can be to get into somebody's home network, is that people simply don't know how to set it up securely. Things that are overlooked, I think definitely people. I strongly believe that every organization needs to educate its people in terms of cybersecurity. If you think about the number of emails people are getting on a daily basis, please click here to download your invoice, or please click here to download the PO. Gosh, we're seeing this more and more and more. And what we're seeing is that people are using like words like invoices, purchase orders, those kinds of things to try to get people to click on malicious links. So that people training is super, super important. Then we talked just now also around data. So IT. It's the job of IT to make sure that your databases are protected, your IT infrastructure is protected. But this actually goes on a little bit further. So if you think about it, a lot of people connect into an ERP system, and they often export that data to try to do some kind of analysis and that kind of thing. And then what you end up doing is you export a whole bunch of data into these Excel files. You potentially saving it onto your desktop or onto a online file storage system. So that data starts to, you start to think about, what could potentially compromise the data. So if I'm just emailing the file out, am I mailing that file out with the necessary protection to prevent other people from mailing out my company data out even more? Or even think about encrypting devices. So if you, let's say you save your document on your desktop and your laptop, and your laptop gets stolen, it's really easy just to actually take your drive out, and someone will actually be able to access your data. So thinking about encrypting your disk to make sure that even if your devices do get stolen, your data doesn't go with it necessarily. And then mobile devices. So no longer are we just doing work on a PC. If you think about, so many people are using tablets, using mobile phones to check emails. So you need to think about how these devices are managed. I think also what happens in organizations is you think, okay, well, I've got security in place, but these aren't necessarily checked. So it's really important to do checks regularly on your cybersecurity policies, as well as any measures that you put in place to make sure that actually these things are all current. Then lastly, I think really important is to have a plan for when things go wrong. When you sit in on cybersecurity talks, what they often say is, it's not a matter of if something will go wrong, it's a matter of actually when. So if something does go wrong, well, when something does go wrong, make sure that you have a plan so you're not responding reactively to these situations. Okay. Oh gosh, okay, it looks like we lost Toby for a second there. Just one moment, sorry about that, everybody.
He's back.
He's back, yeah. Toby, welcome back.
One of the many problems with working from home is the inexplicable breakdown of communication. I can't even blame the IT manager because I am on the phone. But let's move on, and I'm going to come back to you, Colin, because we're seeing a lot of stuff moving into the cloud, aren't we? And the cloud it's fantastic because it's, wherever you are, you can get your data, but it does have, you do need to do things to make sure that your data is secure and that your services are secure.
So Toby, I'm gonna pick that one up. Maybe I think that was meant for me. You're very, very soft there. We can barely hear you. But I think the question was, I think, around security in the cloud, if I'm not mistaken. So I think this is a bit of a misnomer, and I think we've got to be very, very careful. When we say people have moved to the cloud or organizations have moved to the cloud, and then we think we're inherently safe, it's a fairly big misnomer. I think one or two of the stats, and it's always interesting having a look, most people are now in the cloud in some shape or form. So, the stat that we have is that 94% of organizations are now in the cloud, either in a completely private cloud or a completely public cloud or a hybrid version thereof. I think what is very important is to understand what you've put in the cloud and how you've put it in the cloud is critically important. And also understand what you're consuming of the cloud. So if we take something like, and I'll use Office 365 as a software as a service, the backend provider in that instance, Microsoft, has taken care of a lot of the patching of the machines on the back, and they're providing a service to you. If you take something like infrastructure as a cloud, where you may have chosen just to have bare bones infrastructure and you put a virtual machine on top of that, you are still going to be in some instances responsible for making sure that that virtual machine that you put there is fully secured. So I think my answer to the question is, cloud doesn't mean inherently security. No, you've got to be very careful about what you're putting in the cloud and understand. And when we get to data, we'll have that conversation. Understanding, for instance, where your data resides, how you've chosen to protect it, or even that cloud provider is protecting it for you, is critical and important. So I think to answer the question is, no, by going to the cloud doesn't mean you're inherently secure. You need to still make sure that you've applied good principles, you've applied identity principles to the cloud, and remember that you may have chosen to put one app in cloud 1 and another app in cloud 2, and they need to speak to each other. You're going to need an identity piece of software or technology that's going to manage the identity between those. They're not going to come inherently with the cloud, as an example. So I hope that sort of answers the question. We still need to be very careful about how we put things and where we put things in the cloud.
Indeed, and I hope you can hear me. Can everyone hear me clearly? Yes, all good. I'm going to come back to you, Elaine, because there's a lot of interest in small businesses, and people choose between free and paid for services in every regard, but very often in terms of security. I'm deeply paranoid, and obviously I pay for very good security to make sure that I am safe in multiple layers and multiple ways. How are you finding the SME now? Because that's, of course, the real driver of economic change and job creation, isn't it?
Toby, thanks for that. Sorry, you asked a little bit soft. So I'm just going to kind of recap the question there. So this is really around small businesses. Times are tough, let's face it. And I know that when times are tough, businesses look to see where they can save. And I think SMEs are notorious for using either free or consumer grade products, because typically these are really, really attractive in terms of price points. And I think, they offer a good level of security for your laptops, for your desktops, and that kind of thing. And I think it works well if you're a startup working on your own. But as soon as you start bringing more people into the organization, it starts to get a lot more complex. And you have to really think about this from a management point of view. I've seen plenty of customers use consumer grade security, and one of the downfalls is that there's nowhere to centrally manage all your security. So what ends up happening is that you get a new employee in your organization, and you buy a new license, and all these licenses start to expire at different times, which means that potentially you end up in a situation where people aren't actually adequately protected because they potentially don't have an existing subscription. So that's one of the big benefits of business grade security, is that as an organization, you can actually manage your security all up. You're able to do things like pushing out updates and pushing out patches directly from the administrator into the endpoint devices, which makes sure that you can always secure your environment. The other thing is that business security will also help to cover things like servers, which consumer solutions don't. So it really does bring a lot of benefits. Then the last thing I think is really important, and we're seeing this a lot more and more, is that business grade security products, or at least the good ones, are now all building in some level of machine learning and AI into their offerings to help businesses stay up to date with protection. If you think about it, these cyber threats are evolving so quickly, so it's really important that the security solutions are able to keep up with these changes. Okay, so it looks like we lost Toby again. Actually, maybe for the audience, just out of curiosity, what kind of solution are you using? So if I have a look at the poll results, have you ever had a cyber attack in your organization? 38% of you saying yes, 33% says no, and I think a very scary 28% are saying I don't know. I think one of the things about cyber attacks really is that often you actually don't know until it's too late. For those of you who have said, I don't know, or maybe those of you who've said, no, potentially you don't know about it. So really important that you have a good security solution. Let's maybe launch into our next poll. I'm wondering which security solutions you guys do have in place. Are you using a business grade security or using consumer security? Or maybe you don't know, maybe you don't have any security in your environment. So curious to see what the audience is using. And welcome back, Toby.
What can I say? This never happened to me before. The second time I jumped myself out of the queue just to see if I could get a better signal. Hopefully everyone can hear me now. So yes, indeed, and I run my own small business, and managing security across multiple households, different people, different services, it really is quite complex. I mean, I suppose, Simon, one of the other concerns is people say, well, if cloud service providers all have security, why do I need an extra security system? I don't address your comments to me because I'm deeply paranoid and I believe in redundancy. So should people be asking that question, or is it a no-brainer for someone like me that, of course, you must have multiple levels of security?
Yeah, thanks, Toby. I know Colin touched a bit on this comment earlier, and I think the big concern that a lot of businesses are moving to the likes of AWS, Azure, Google Cloud. I think the biggest concern that companies don't take into place is that those cloud vendors are actually not providing the security within the cloud. They're securing the perimeter of the cloud itself along those lines, but what happens within the cloud is up to you. And I think that's the biggest problem that a lot of organizations don't take into account, is that, yes, they believe that, Azure or AWS is going to make sure that they're not getting breached. But, you look at some of the breaches that have happened. I think Uber was one of the big one where they accidentally left some public keys and security keys within their cloud platform, and they were able to, that was, gathered from, I guess, some risky organization, and was they were extorted out of that. That becomes a bit of a problem. And I think a lot of the times is that organizations are, relying on their cloud architects and the cloud team to implement security. And I mean, sometimes the cloud guys are, they don't understand the controls and the security that needs to be put in place to actually ensure that they are protected. So I think the big thing that we're seeing today is the misconfiguration within the cloud. So, guys are creating accounts with AWS Azure, and, they're not enforcing the likes of, two-factor authentication, or, they're using default passwords, and that can just become a big issue. So, looking at the likes of, a third-party security control, I think, yeah, there's definitely still a play for those organizations. We need to have the likes of, Bitdefender securing AWS and Azure. But yeah, the controls in those platforms are still beneficial for the business themselves to make sure that we are protected. So yeah, Toby, that's what I feel.
Indeed. And I mean, I suppose part of this issue is all around identity protection, isn't it? Like I'm deeply paranoid. Relatives of mine in the States have had their identity stolen and credit cards run up in hundreds of thousands of dollars. So I've seen or experienced through my family what problems this can be. But there's also a much more important identity concept for digital users. And Elaine, I suppose this is part of the services Rectron offers, which is identity management. It's absolutely crucial to know the people accessing your system or in your system or who they say they are. They are really Joe Buthelezi, who is connecting to the system.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think this is where, company policies also become very important, and also really important for IT and I think HR to have the conversation, but also for IT and business to have discussions. I think at the most basic level between IT and HR, know who actually works for the company currently. So if anyone leaves the company, make sure that they get removed from all company resources. But then also have role-based access. So, potentially your receptionist doesn't need access to everything within like a SharePoint if your finance director is using it as an example. And then also just for IT and business to talk, to understand what other applications businesses are using. And I think that where this comes from is that shadow IT is a reality in a lot of organizations. People do come in with their own technologies because they maybe found another tool that they thought was easier to use. And to know, and I think it's important that, when IT and business talk, they actually understand each other, know what's important to each other, so that IT can actually put the right solutions in place. Then the other type of business app is potentially a business app that, your users may need to log into because they need to work with another organization, so like a vendor or a customer, whatever it is. And often these are things that aren't actually monitored anywhere in the organization. So I think this is once again where IT and business need to know who each other are and need to talk to make sure that IT does have a handle on even those logins, to make sure somebody does leave the organization that potentially they don't retain access to a customer environment. And then just lastly, I think Simon talked briefly about multi-factor authentication. I think that in this day and age, it is an absolute must. Passwords just aren't secure. I know there's loads of password managers, so that you can generate different passwords for every site, but to take this one step further and use a multi-factor authenticator. So yes, can be done through SMS, through email, or even through an authentication app. And I found personally that these authentication apps work really, really nicely, super easy to use, super easy to install, and that just gives you that one extra level of assurance to know that the person logging into your system is actually the person that's supposed to be logging into your system.
I have to agree about the authenticator apps, because even though SMS is seemingly a useful second factor, your number can be stolen, and enough of those personal bank accounts and other things. So I've also shifted over to using authenticator apps. Very simple, very easy, and available from Microsoft. Very efficient.
Yeah.
Peter, I'm going to come to you, and I'm sorry we haven't spoken yet so far, but how do you secure a remote workforce? I mean, this is one of the biggest issues that people are facing. I mean, what are all the things people need to think about?
Well, Toby, thank you. Yeah, I think a number of the key points to consider have already been mentioned by the panelists thus far, but I would like to highlight a few of the points and maybe bring in a few additional. So first and foremost, I think before we start thinking about what tools to throw at the job, which is typically what I like to do, is use some tools to solve these problems. But first, to define a remote working policy, even for the smallest business, remote working do's and don'ts, be it that simple or that straightforward, for your remote workforce. I mean, in this document, and it should be a document, not just a bunch of ideas, one should mandate and define what approved applications are being or to be used, what VPN tools are being used to access your corporate network, what your encryption requirements are. All of these elements need to be considered. Then, I mean, defining simple policies. Keep company data on company computers. Elaine mentioned an example earlier, exporting some documentation from a cloud platform and storing it on another platform or on another system. You might want to move it across to another computer in the house, in a shared computer. You put it on a flash drive, and all of a sudden, this data is now vulnerable and can be accessed by somebody who gains access to this remote device. So defining these basic steps is essential. Avoiding public Wi-Fi where possible. Now, I know that this is not always possible. Working from coffee shops, etc., is quite common now that we are allowed to leave our homes again. But when you do work in public hotspots and public Wi-Fi locations, ensure that you're using a VPN that's encrypting all your traffic so you cannot have eavesdroppers listen in. Then on the points of MFA, multi-factor authentication, use of a password manager, I advise use both. For websites and services where there isn't yet MFA available, well, consider using others, but otherwise, if it's a must, implement a really strong password and store it in a password manager which has access from a multi-factor authentication application. Gosh, you can go on with this. I mean, there are so many points to consider, but to highlight just a few, another overlooked factor really is on your home network security. We've mentioned your default admin username and passwords on your routers, the default SSID being used. You should switch away from these, from what's printed on your router sticker underneath it. If someone were to walk in, they can flip over your router. I see the SSID's default with the vendor name in it. The password is probably also going to be printed on there. So updating the firmware of your routers, ensuring that all the devices are up to date, all your software applications are up to date. These are essential things just to be defined and written out. Of course, enforcing them and getting the users trained and equipped to do this, or having your in-house IT being able to support your users in performing these functions, is also key. So you have a nice document, you say it must do this. It's the measures that go in place and the processes that go in place to ensure that those are adhered to. Additional to this, we mentioned the data sprawl or the data distribution. With all the remote users, you no longer have this big net of where everybody's working within a controlled environment. There isn't this single perimeter. There isn't necessarily this single point of control. And leveraging the right tools now can bring it in and make it more manageable. So maybe managing the perimeter in these remote sites is not that easy, but if you're serious about your security, you could offer a secure firewall to deploy to your user sites, or VPNing in and then having controlled traffic or controlling all the web traffic that happens at these sites. Beyond that, I mean, utilizing an RMM tool or remote management and monitoring tool is vital for getting a handle on the remote devices that do connect and operate and work with your company data, to maintain the basics. Your antivirus, ensuring that's up to date, ensuring your operating system and the applications you are using are up to date, and just for having a general foothold on the devices and that are accessing your network. Of course, it would be wrong of me not to mention it's essential to ensure you have a strict backup policy in place. It's one thing to be having all these users working remotely, working on data in an uncontrolled environment. They're still working remotely, so they're still generating content, they're still generating valuable assets for your business. How do we ensure those are protected now? Having a reliable encrypted cloud backup solution is vital for that. And yet again, educating the users. I did mention that briefly. Incorporate relevant security tips into your internal communication, maybe in your stand-up meetings and your regular engagements with your team. It's a vital and probably more overlooked element is, feeding relevant and current content, notifying on current threats, and providing access perhaps to an internal learning platform with curated and customized content that's relevant to your company, to your industry, and to your team. Those are a few tips I would give.
I'm pleased to say that I think I do everything that you mentioned there, and that's a really good checklist, because you have to think of all of those things. And I'm going to come back to you with another question in a second, Peter. But Colin, you're very au fait with Poppy and the requirements of that. What are the extra things people are going to have to worry about? Because now, if you have customer data, it's incumbent on you to protect that. And there are now, from next July, there will be legal consequences.
Yeah, Toby, so let's just actually go through that very quickly, because Poppy or Poppy has been around for quite some time now. But I think the major change was that on the 1st of July 2020, the president actually proclaimed this as an act. And we were given 12 months as an industry, as South Africa, to get ourselves ready for this. And if you work that back to your point, July next year is D-Day. So we've got about 9 months left. There are a couple of things. I mean, as a basis, you mentioned it, what this does is it places the onus on the organization to make sure that you are collecting, using, and processing people's data in a prescribed manner. You know, and I always say to people, when you start looking at the way you collect data, as an example, you need to now have you need to have the permission of the individual to collect the data, and you are only allowed to use the data for the intended purpose that you collected it. You know, and quite often as organizations, you know, you send out an RSVP for a webinar or whatever it may be, and you include a bunch of questions on there. If you don't need that data, don't collect it. You know, if you don't need somebody's shoe size, don't collect it. And we have to be very specific about the way that is done. If I were to give some advice to people, it comes in 3 steps. Before I do get there, though, one of the major things that you are going to have to do as well as an organization is to put a DPO in place, so a data protection or privacy officer. And really what that is let's say Colin Erasmus phones Toby, you've got information on me, and I want to know what information you have on me. You're going to have a DPO in place to actually answer those questions, and you've got a legal obligation to do so. So for all organizations, and I know we can't afford to have a specific individual sitting there maybe just doing that, but you need to make sure that you have somebody inside your organization, maybe even a governance council, that can take care of those sorts of things, because those are the small things that can trip you up. There are 3 things that I would say to organizations to look out for. The first one is know your data. So know what data you have, and go and ask yourself a very simple question after this, is go and ask yourself a question of, where is my sensitive data today inside my organization? Peter mentioned it, you know, is this on a memory stick sitting somewhere? Is it on somebody's PC? Is it on a file share? Who has access to those sorts of things, et cetera, et cetera? That's the first thing that you need to answer yourself on. And I will say another very interesting stat, Toby, is that we believe that 80% of organizations today have dark data. In other words, i.e. they haven't classified their data. So they have terabytes and terabytes of data, but they don't know what of that data is publicly available information, so we don't really want to protect it too much. Secondly, what is sensitive information, so may contain things like ID numbers of individuals, for financial institutions, credit card information, et cetera, et cetera. And you can imagine certain industries will be harder hit. Take the healthcare industry. That sort of data is exceptionally sensitive on persons' information around their health. So know your data is critical. Protect your data is the next criticality. So once you understand where your data is you need to understand how you're going to protect that data. And that could be everything from encrypting the data, we've mentioned that already, to potentially just tagging the data if it's sitting on a file share or a SharePoint site or whatever that may be. And the last thing is govern your data. That is critically important. So you need to understand, once you have this data, once you know where it's going and where it's stored, how do you govern it? And the last thing I will say about that is that we need to make sure that we do that in an intelligent and automated fashion. There's just too much data today to have somebody trying to do this themselves and click and move, et cetera, et cetera. We need to make sure that we've applied tools that allow us to do this. And we need to make sure that when we put policies in place, that these are actionable policies and aren't just a piece of paper that's sit there. So really, last bit on that matter is govern, protect, know, protect, and govern your data. Those are the 3 steps that you need to look at.
And important, because the next question I have for Peter is, what do you do when you get hit by a ransomware attack? Because that's just become a security threat that seemed like the kind of thing happens in movies. Die Hard 4, I think, was the entire plot of it. And now the city of Joburg, just about everyone possible. And I see Ryan Berkner from a small attorney's firm is talking about a ransomware attack that happened in July. I'll go into the details in the question series at the end, Ryan. But what do companies do? You've got to have not just security, you've got to have backups, multiple backups that aren't linked, so that if the one gets corrupted, the others aren't.
Look, it's a wonderful question, this, and I use it quite often in interviews as well, because it goes through the process of thinking and understanding what the risk is. And maybe just speaking back to movie references here, it's important to have a DEFCON 1 strategy defined for any size business. You know, if you recall the movie Taken, when Frank Miller is on the phone with his daughter and saying, you know, we want Taken now, and these are the next steps you must do in order to help us. It's
can we just stop and say I also want Liam Neeson to be the guy who comes if I ever have problems. But
absolutely.
But it's important, isn't it? It freaked me out, that movie. But from reading and hearing the horror stories of people captured, you know, by soldiers in Afghanistan, or, you know, if that happens, thank God it's not us being personally captured, but it is. People need to be conscious that there's no going, damn, I wish I could alt control, you know, quickly alt control delete or control Z it. Once your data is captured, that's a very good analogy. You've got to get into that crisis mode, don't you?
Absolutely. And I mean, with any breach and any attack, actually, it's vital to have a what now approach, DEFCON 1, or maybe even grade it based on the type of breach. But when it comes to ransomware, it's serious. And I suppose it's really who is noticing the attack. If it's just the end user, every individual in the company should know. If I see a ransomware alert pop up on my machine, first things first, disconnect it from the network. Before you do anything else, before you make a phone call, before you drink another sip of your coffee, get your system off the network. You can limit the spread. It may already be too late, it's hard to tell. But that would be the first step. Then, following the procedures in your lockdown mode of your own, the next important steps would be to, well, isolate the systems that are infected, identify the type of threat, possibly if there is a ransom message, you know, don't connect to the internet with that same system and try Google, how do I clean this? Keep that machine offline. Take a photo of the ransom message with your cell phone, perhaps, just so you have the details on hand and you can make a reference and hand it on to an expert. Disconnect any external hard drives from the system and, well, then inform your InfoSec team. Then, utilizing the tools at hand to clean it up if you need to. If you have a reliable and an efficient backup strategy in place with, you know, regular checkpoints of your data, it might not even be worth trying to clean or remove an infection. While you would like to do that to restore operations quickly, I would say, you know, downtime is costly, but I would rather have 2 or 3 hours of downtime to restore a system from a reliable backup than 2 or 3 weeks or infinite downtime because all my data is encrypted and I don't have a secure copy of it. So, yeah, ring fencing, bring it down, disconnect it, identify what data is affected by what, and yeah, if you don't have backups in place, well, you can start praying, but avoid at all costs, if you can, paying for the ransom. That's your own decision, of course. There is a whole separate discussion around what the paying of ransom goes to and what you're funding with that. But yet again, if it means your company is going to close down after it's up to you. It's in your hands to decide what to do there.
I don't mean to be facetious, but I was listening to your notes, your points, making a note. Ring fence, bring it down, find backup, start praying. It's kind of like, have you ever read that thing about giving a cat a pill? You know, it's kind of like, you know, bandage your arm, go wrap your arm in a curtain, try again with the cat. It kind of is like one of those crazy situations where you're in a total state of panic and preparedness. That's what you need. Proper preparedness. That PPP thing. That's really kind of critical, I suppose. Colin, you see a lot of this, and I know that in the past you've been the lead for Microsoft Security Initiative in South Africa. So you'll have seen a lot of this. I suppose there's other complications because of shadow IT. Other people are involved in other issues or doing their own kind of stuff. There's just more. There are more factors involved, aren't there?
Yeah, and maybe just to answer a little bit of light on the ransomware, as we've been around the country and we've done a little bit of investigation with some of our big customers. Peter, I mean, as you mentioned, the ransomware is getting very real out there. I think the interesting thing is it's getting very personal. We're finding that ransomware is now written one for individuals or for organizations, and sometimes sits there for months without being picked up. So very, very interesting conversation. I suppose it leads to shadow IT. I think you need to go back and we need to have a look at our security strategies that we deploy inside organizations. And, for quite some time, we've often had conversations around bringing the younger workforce into, so Generation Z and all the rest of these guys, and what they require and what they need. And it's very important because if you're going to build a modern workforce, you need to understand what people want. And quite often, the workforce will come with their own ideas, right? So, this application is potentially better than this, or I'm going to use data from here. And I think that's where it really starts. And I think it does come back to, at the end of the day, is what does our security architecture look like when we start off, and where do we want to go? We quite often talk about this zero trust architecture concept, which is what Microsoft's built their security on as an example. And really the intent is that we start from a basis where we believe that we always under attack. And that we're always under a breach. And that's really where it does start. So what Zero Trust looks at is it looks at an integrated approach. And I think that's the critical bit, is that security is integrated in what we're doing. Because the same thing, what we're trying to do is eliminate actually slowing our systems and our productivity down by adding layers on top of. And I know that's critical, that's difficult, but an integrated approach I think is very, very important for us. That has adjustable controls. Now, Elaine spoke a little bit about this, and this is where your security is absolutely key, that it uses adjustable controls. And let me give an example. So we've spoken about conditional access, we've spoken about multi-factor authentication, but when we talk about adjustable controls from a security point of view, let's say, Tobin, I think I've used this example with you in the past, is if I log onto my PC now, and in an hour's time or 2 hours time, it looks like I'm logging onto my PC from Hong Kong or the US, whatever it is, we know that that's not practically possible. So what I'll do is I'm going to throw an additional control at the user now. I'm going to say, hang on, I now need to apply multi-factor authentication because I don't believe that you are who you say you are. And I'm now going to ask you an additional question. And security is sometimes about what you know, which is your password, and potentially what you have, as we've spoken about it. So that could be your cell phone, it could be something else. And then continuous monitoring. And that's where Elaine spoke about the AI stuff that's coming to security. That is absolutely critical. So if you're looking for shadow IT, starts with that sort of a concept today. And it starts with things like least privileged and just-in-time type access. So we're understanding what people are accessing and how they're accessing. So identity and access management, and you've spoken about a lot, becomes the key to making sure that we are managing the identities across this hybrid environment. So not just identities on premise or what we know, but across everything that we do. And by doing those sorts of things, we are going to start getting rid of and catching a lot of the shadow IT that goes around it and eliminating some of the threats that we see.
Indeed. I mean, Elaine, let me ask you, what are some of the other tools that you can help mitigate risk here? AI or machine learning is very useful because it will spot Colin managed to get to Hong Kong in 2 hours. Is the what was it called, the very fast jet that they decommissioned?
Concorde.
The Concorde.
Concorde, is the Concorde back? What are some of the other things you can use?
Well, look, I mean, I think you need to actually chat to your IT service providers just so they understand what you have in your environment. But yeah, I think use reputable security tools. So from our side, we're really big in terms of driving and usage around Bitdefender and around Microsoft 365, which also has security tools brought in place. Then Acronis really nicely recently brought in Cyber Protect, which is another security tool to help you. So I think there's so many in the market. What we'll do maybe after this webinar is to actually reach out to the people who have attended and just to see what your requirements are, and we'll recommend a solution based on where you are in your journey and where we see the gaps in your environment. So I think it's something that you really need to consult on.
Great, and Belinda, Elise, we will come back to you as well, and Ryan Berkner about your specific questions if we can't deal with them. I see we've only got 10 minutes left, but I've still got some pretty important questions because I wanted to speak to you again, Peter. I mean, there's some high-profile data breaches. The Experian one is the most recent. And what do you do? What advice would you give to people to avoid ending up in these situations?
Yeah, look, I mean, the weekly headlines we are seeing every week, it's just a new big name company with a breach, local and abroad. And I think in the IT world, it's a global community. We can, a US company being attacked digitally is just on our doorstep. It's 220 milliseconds away, give or take. So with this, it's worth thinking of these high-profile breaches as digital heists. It's no longer just a spray and pray approach or throw it against the wall and see what sticks, which is what earlier stage ransomware and malware may have been. These are very well crafted, well thought out attacks. And so I think in that frame of mind, it's really hard to have a cure for it. We can only take preventative measures. We can only have the necessary processes in place to deal with the attack when it does take place, or if it does take place. Similar to the taken situation, once again, you are going to be taken, you are under attack. This is what we do. But the day-to-day things that you and I, an everyday person, can do, from our home user through to a business user, it is the basics. Once again, the securing your system with your antivirus or anti-malware, the secure cloud backups, essential, always essential, and encrypted cloud backups. Because another thing to note now with these modern ransomware attacks, it's no longer just we're not going to give you your data back unless you pay us. It's if you don't pay us, we're going to give your data out too, and we're going to expose it to the internet. So it's one thing, I can't get it, but now other people can. And this is something we need to prevent with good encryption, and that comes down to the policies we have in place. But then coming back to the important element here is user training. Teach users and teach your team to be extremely skeptical. Implement systems of trust, such as these identity management tools, but also in a smaller business, it may be quite practical. If I need a password reset, instead of me sending an SMS to somebody or an email to somebody saying, oh, please reset my password and send it to me, maybe have a short video call on WhatsApp or whatever it might be, where trust can be validated without a doubt. And of course, yes, in larger organizations, it might pay to deepfake one of those and really manipulate your IT manager to giving out secure credentials. But in the practical, usable sense for the day-to-day person here, we need to take basic measures to ensure that we're not going to get infiltrated, because we are the point of entry typically for these malicious and bad actors to enter into our corporate networks.
Indeed, and I'm going to come back to you, Simon. Are we ever going to be 100% secure? I'm going to ask everybody this question. Is it possible for us to ever be 100% secure?
So, I mean, to be honest, I don't believe there's, we can ever be 100% secure, but we can get close to that. I think, Colin and Peter spoke about the targeted attacks, the security awareness along those lines. And I think the problem where it comes down to is, we hear the term human firewall. This becomes our first line of defense. The guys who are sitting behind the computers who are clicking on links, they're receiving emails and they're receiving these type of phishing campaigns, they haven't had the sort of the security awareness training that organizations need. And that's sometimes a big concern, because sometimes, it's the person in your organization who's actually allowing, something malicious to come into the organization, which becomes a bit of a problem. I know Colin touched a bit on the layered approach, so allowing for layered security. You speak about having your AV, your AI, your machine learning type of capabilities, making sure encryption's set in place, even trying to lock down, I guess, external ports within your machine. Not allowing your users to plug in USBs, sharing movies, sharing content, because sometimes there's malicious malware that could be sitting on that. So we can get close. I think the big drive, and the guys have touched on it, is security awareness is key. We need to make sure that the guys who are working on our machines within an organization understand what they're looking at and what they're clicking on. We all talk about the breaches that have happened, and generally a lot of those breaches that have occurred have been because of one user who's clicked on a malicious link, and that's really caused the infection across large organizations. So security awareness is number one, and I think the later approach would be the other option, is making sure that you have all the controls in place. But sometimes your controls aren't set to best practice, because maybe there's an in-house application that's been created, and the guys have said, no, can you create an exclusion? And the guys are disabling controls, and before you have a backdoor into an organization. So security awareness is number one. That's what I believe in it.
I have to agree, and I really do think over-awareness and paranoia is correct. I mean, it's fascinating to me. South Africans will build a 10-foot wall, put on razor wire, machine gun emplacements. If you come anywhere near the house, armed security guards come and, shoot first and ask questions later. And then they'll use, as you mentioned, Peter, the default username and password for their router, where much more secure stuff is happening. What's your advice? Can we ever be 100% secure? What's the top few things you think people should do?
Gosh, well, I don't think one can be 100% secure. It's asymptotic, really, where, as Simon mentioned just now, you can always tend towards security, but you'll never reach this state of 100% security. And well, if you do, then maybe your device will not be connected to the internet and have anything ever communicate with it, which in itself won't be useful for, its purpose. So, I mean, the basic steps for me and you, I think it's repeating the same. It's your tools that you have in place, your anti-malware up-to-date, software up-to-date, no running of, the Windows XPs and those likes because you like the way the start menu looks, but you're still connecting to the internet. You need to be up to date. You need to be secured. You need to ensure your data is, where your data is. You have another copy of your data, ideally in the cloud and encrypted. These are the basic steps for security. And of course, we've already repeated those key points on passwords and MFA. Just introduce that into your day-to-day operation with your personal data, with your company data. We need to think securely. We need to act securely. The same way, when you go out into the road driving a car, there are some basic principles: looking left, looking right. We're entering the information superhighway here. It's dangerous, it's fast, and a lot's going on all the time. So ensure you are adequately prepared. You've got your license. You can enter the highway safely. Very simple. It doesn't mean you're going to be 100% secure, but it's the best effort.
Agreed. And Elaine, I'm giving you the last word. What should people be concerned with and be doing?
So I think the last thing is also to always test the controls that you have in place and test out your security. And I think there's various tools that you can use to do it. I know if you're a Microsoft 365 user, as an example, they actually do have tools that you can test it out. And I think you'd be surprised with what you come back with. So test out, example, your users. Make sure that they are informed, but then test them to see what they actually do in a situation like a potential phishing attack. And then on top of that, always review your policies. Don't just take for granted that you have one. I think this is something that at audit time you do need to come back and make sure that you that these are all still relevant.
Indeed. Well, we're coming to an end, so I'm just going to sum up quickly what we've discussed. Of course, the most important thing is that security is the most important thing, and it's not just a one size fits all approach. You need to customize it for your organization, for your users. How you're working. Colin from Microsoft mentioned the zero trust architecture that Microsoft starts with, which is always expect to be under attack or in a breach, and be conscious of how you need to think of worst case scenarios. Peter was talking about it just that we live in an age of digital heists, don't we? American companies may be hacked, but as he points out, that's 220 milliseconds away from us. It's quite remarkable. His advice for security, and especially ransomware, is make sure you have ring fencing, make sure the machine that's involved is isolated, bring it down, have good backups, and have encrypted backups so that if people do get hold of your data and you don't want to pay them, that they can't release your data, that your data is secure. Because of course, as all of the speakers have mentioned, from July next year, all South African businesses are going to be under the spotlight for the data protection in terms of the POPI Act or POPIA Act that will govern how data is used, our personal data, by companies. Elaine has been stressing the importance of multi-factor authentication, especially using apps instead of SMS over the air signals. And quite importantly, as she's just said, test your controls, test your security, check what you can and can't do with it. And Simon has quite rightly pointed out that in this age of COVID lockdown and working from home, the threats have just multiplied. There are concerns around shadow IT and other people's technology, multiple services being hosted on different cloud services, and just the overall importance, to my mind, of being very conscious of the fact that security is now as important as any other form of service that you get, and it should be a line item, to my mind, in every business's budget, even if you're a small business, and especially if you're a small business, because access to your business is critical. Personally, my business philosophy as a small business owner is do what you're good at, hire other people to do what you're not good at. In most cases, that means hire a really good accountant. I don't speak maths as a first language, as most people probably don't. But I do understand IT, so I've been aware of the IT challenges. And even then, I have someone who does our IT who makes sure that anything that could be slipping through the cracks aren't. So thank you very much for joining us. We will reach out to the people who ask questions who haven't been completely answered, and please join us again. And if there are if you haven't had any of your questions answered, please email us and let us know, and the panel of much smarter people than I will tell you what to do. And luckily, nobody had a fly on their heads during the talk. Thank you very much for joining us.
Fantastic.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.